Hello and welcome to The Beat, a news and talk program brought to you by the Center for Community Media at Worcester State University. This introduction has been pre-recorded for future episodes due to the unforeseen circumstances that the pandemic may bring. We hope you enjoy this segment.
You have been honored as this year's recipient of the Binienda Center's Community Leader Award. The Binienda Center promotes collaboration among Worcester State University faculty, local organizations, and businesses. How has civic and community engagement contributed to your professional campaigns and political career?
A lot of this has to do with, why should anybody be involved in anything to do with civic engagement? And, I really strongly believe that the world is the way that it is, not because it's naturally good or fair or right. It's how it is because we make it that way or because we let it get that way. And so that means that all of us have an obligation, but I also think an opportunity to do things that involve making the world into the kind of place that we think it should be. So, for me, I think that the opportunities that I've had to participate in civic life, whether it's just as a voter or being involved in campaigns or running myself or being involved in efforts to change the way we vote, to make it more fair and open. I just think that all of us should be doing those things, and because it benefits all of us. It's again, I think the thing to remember always is that the natural state of life is not for it to be ideal, but we can make it that way if we work at it.
So how should the business community be involved in the democratic process?
So much of what we see with businesses in the democratic process is them distorting it in many ways. With the big money, the idea that corporations are people. These things are problems. With that said, there are so many good things that people that are in business can do to help public life. A simple one, a real simple example is voting day, election day. And I know there's opportunities to vote prior to election day, but companies ought to give their workers time off to go vote. It ought to be, you don't have to take PTO, you don't have to, you just should go and vote, and the business should help you do that. I think that there should be a notion of civic obligation that business leaders have, and that goes beyond saying, hey, let me try to change a law in a way that helps me make more money for my company or for my shareholders, but rather, why don't I use the position of influence and power and authority that I have as a business person to do good things, and to be part of improving the world and doing the things that I talked about before, about, again, making the world into the place that we think it should be, where it's fair, where it's equitable, where people are treated equally, and where our voices are heard. So I think that, there's an opportunity for business leaders, and I think we need more business leaders to speak out and remind business leaders of their obligations, their civic duty to participate in that process.
What advice can you give to those listening in terms of the importance of community engagement?
Look, if you're a student at Worcester State, if you're a student in the Binienda Center, you already know how important it is to be involved in civic engagement. So I think the most important advice that I would give is the one that I always remind myself, which is keep going. Reform is not for the short-winded or the impatient, but it does happen if you continue to work at it and don't give up. So find things that you feel passionate about and that make an impact in the ways that you want to see, and dedicate yourself to them. And don't be surprised when you don't always win, or when the process is frustrating, but know that the cause in and of itself is worthy, and that people around you, when they see you doing things in a civic way geared towards those positive outcomes, they'll feel that call to do something themselves. So it's an opportunity, and I congratulate everybody that's there at Worcester State and associated with the Binienda Center because of that level of leadership. It's so important. It's it's an amazing thing, right? I mean, just the notion of it existing in the first place, and the idea that there's going to be a structure at a university for the purpose of bringing together various parts, but also that kind of leadership. I mean, Mark is great, and Barry Maloney as well, have the same vision. it really makes a difference.
So how should we educate young people to create a healthier democracy and healthier communities?
I think one thing that we're not doing enough of in our country, and I'm talking about young people before they get to college, is teaching them about civics in general. A lot of us have had the opportunity, for example, when you see a play like Hamilton or listen to the music, a lot of people are learning a lot about American history and the ideals of our country from that, and that's a great thing. But there needs to be so much more of that happening. The folks who started our country, for all the flaws that they had as people from the 18th century, they were brilliant in terms of articulating and brave in doing so, to say that everybody is created equal, everybody has inalienable rights. It's provocative to write those things down and to say them, because it forces you then to say, okay, if these things are true, how do we look at the world around us and allow it to continue to be unfair, inequitable, treating people without reference to the fact that they're actually equal to everybody else. So it's a call to action. And so the more we can teach younger people and be involved in that civics education to teach them about those principles, the more they're going to be feeling as if they've got to do something about it, that it's not acceptable for things to be the way that they are. And it's interesting when you think about the social media culture that exists today. You can get on Twitter and I think the term that people have used a lot during COVID has been doom scrolling. As you go through your Twitter, it's a lot of people saying God isn't terrible. Not enough people saying, and here's what we're going to do about it. There are some. I follow a lot of people that are working to bring about positive change. But there needs to be a culture shift in the way we think about public life and civic life that says, no, this is an opportunity. Yes, there are things we don't like, but we are able to make them different and better.
You operated as the chair on the Yes and Two campaign. Could you please explain your role and standpoint on that?
Yeah, so back in 2014, I was an independent candidate for governor of Massachusetts. And one of the biggest challenges that I had as a candidate was people saying, I love the idea of an independent candidate, but I can't vote for you because you can't win. And worse than that, I'm afraid that if I do vote for you, it's going to change the outcome, that you're going to be a spoiler. And that was tough. And you talk to people that have been organizing in independent politics all around the country, and they say that's the biggest challenge they face. There's lots of polls that show that people want independent candidates, they want independent political thought, but they don't vote for it. And it's really because of that. Well, I learned about ranked choice voting, which is a simple, fair upgrade to the way we vote that makes it possible for you to rank your choices. So in a 3-person race like the one that I was in, you can rank your first choice. And if that person doesn't have enough votes to win, that vote gets eliminated, and now your second choice counts. And that way you get rid of the spoiler effect, because the winner has to have at least 50% of the vote. So if nobody gets 50%, then you recount using the second choices, and it works. I said, boy, that's brilliant, because if I had been a candidate in a ranked choice election and someone said, I can't vote for you because you can't win, I can say to them, instead of saying what I felt like saying, which was, well, with that mentality, of course I can't win, say, okay, fine, put me down as your first choice, and then put the person that you really want to win other than me as your second choice. And that way you get the best of both worlds. And we would see a complete change in the way we campaign and the way we vote. And it would really break the stranglehold of the two political parties on our political process to make it possible for independent candidates to win, to get rid of the argument that, hey, there's going to be a spoiler if there's an independent candidate, to get rid of the idea that you can only vote for one of the two choices that are given to us. And I really fell in love with that as an idea. I became the chair of the effort to get that on the ballot in Massachusetts in 2020, which we did. We got hundreds of thousands of signatures. We earned more votes, more than almost 1.5 million votes. We didn't win, but that's the most that anyone has ever voted for a ranked choice voting ballot initiative in American history. So it's really quite an accomplishment. And one of the results of that has been that there's a number of efforts in local communities around Massachusetts to create a ranked choice system for their local elections, which I think is a great thing. But to me, ranked choice voting is really the future, and it's the way out of this terrible binary situation that we're in from a political perspective in our country. It's either right-wing people who don't speak to the majority of Americans, or it's left-wing people that don't speak to the majority of Americans. And if you're somewhere in the middle and you say, you know, I like some of what I hear from different places, there's nowhere for you to go. Well, if we had ranked choice voting all across America, we'd see a completely new political system. So I continue to be involved in that effort, not just here in Massachusetts, but this is something that over the next 10 years, you know, when I think about how to solve these big problems, you got to have a long time frame. As I've said before, you got to be patient, you got to be persistent, and you got to be dedicated. And I think ranked choice voting is really the answer to so many of these problems.
Why do you think people are opposing ranked choice voting?
I think that there's a degree to which people are comfortable with the status quo in a way that makes it harder to make change. And I think, you know, especially during 2020, when we were dealing with the pandemic and it was very hard to get out there and campaign and really talk to people about this, it was hard to make that kind of change. With that said, we got nearly 1.5 million people to vote for it. There wasn't a groundswell of opposition against it. I think our biggest enemy, so to speak, was people not knowing what ranked choice voting was about and why it would make things better. You know, look, to be sure, there are a core of committed ideological conservatives who don't like ranked choice voting because it opens up the system to more independent voices, more diverse candidates, more diverse voting blocks, which, after all, in a democracy, we should welcome any reform that makes it easier for people to vote, any reform that increases people's voice. But you know, we've seen in our country that there are people who don't agree with that, and they don't like those people don't like ranked choice voting. You know, one thing that I think everyone needs to recognize is that, you know, in the last couple of months, there have been almost 250 bills introduced in legislatures around the country to restrict voting rights. There are people who don't love democracy in the way that we all do, and we really have to work at that.
How does ranked choice voting promote or facilitate the improvement of democracy, and how does this format of voting compare? Well, you've kind of gone over how it goes over the standard in place, but how is it facilitating the improvement of democracy?
There's so many examples of situations in which this happens. It just happened yesterday in a special election for a state representative seat in Eastern Massachusetts, in Winthrop and Revere, and I believe part of Everett. And there were 4 candidates running. 2 of them were fairly progressive. One of them was a bit more fringe, and the 4th one was a self-described Reagan Democrat who has some pro-Trump views and other views that are a bit out of step with the voters in his district. Well, that last guy that I mentioned just won with 36% of the vote, which means that 64% of people wanted somebody else. And the overwhelming majority of the 64% voted for 2 fairly progressive candidates. Now, this is not about me saying, hey, I wish there were more progressives and fewer conservatives, or more conservatives and fewer progressives. But if the voters of that district, a majority of them, wanted someone with the viewpoints that were closer to those progressive candidates, but the person representing them ends up being someone with conservative views, there's something broken in the system. You know, democracy should mean, representative democracy should mean, that the people we elect represent the community from which they come. But if a person wins an election with 36% of the vote and has views that are divergent from the people they're supposed to represent, what is this? It's not fair. It's not right. It doesn't, and more importantly, it doesn't make sense. So, you know, that's how our system currently works, and it's a terrific example of why we need to bring about this kind of needed political reform.
How does your campaign and ranked choice voting include and promote minority group participation at the polls?
Well, it's a really important problem, because you talk to so many people in um, various groups across Massachusetts and around the country who feel as if they're not adequately represented in government, that their voices are not heard, that they don't matter to the candidates. So take an example, in 2013 in Boston, there was a mayoral race. Boston is a majority minority city, all right? And it has a history of a large Irish population, but that's changed tremendously. But in 2013 in the mayor's race, they had a preliminary election and there were, I believe, 13 candidates or 12 candidates. And the top two finishers were two Irish men, Marty Walsh and John Connolly. Everybody else came from one or another of the diverse communities that represent Boston. I'm not saying that Marty and John aren't part of the community of Boston, because they absolutely positively are. And I'm not saying that voters should vote on the basis of their ethnic background and makeup, but there is something that is a little bit off about the idea that the top two finishers would come from a community that is in the minority, whereas the majority is then split among everybody else. That creates cynicism among voters. That makes voters say it doesn't matter. It makes candidates say, boy, I really shouldn't run if I'm going to end up splitting the vote among people that are similarly situated. And the race I mentioned to you before that just happened yesterday in Winthrop, one of the two progressive candidates arguably split the vote with the other one and made it so that the more conservative guy won. That happens with minority communities all the time when people think about running. Oh, don't run, it's not your turn. So any system that is an improvement of our current system needs to have in it the notion that it helps those communities feel better, more represented, and that's what ranked choice voting does.
Changing gears slightly, as a frequent contributor to Commonwealth Magazine, could you give a brief overview on your recent investigation on fake news and, quote, alternative facts?
We're seeing this on a national level, but it's also happening right here in Massachusetts. There is Trump is the extreme example of this, a willingness of a person to straight up say things that aren't true for purposes of making public policy. And we've seen this from other political leaders from the Trump administration many, many times. And I'm not saying that politicians don't sometimes exaggerate or mislead, but what the Trump administration did from day one about talking about the crowd size reflected something different that we really haven't seen before in American politics. One of the things that we ran into in our effort to implement ranked choice voting were some ideological conservatives who used those same tactics against us. All right, now we did not lose this election because of these tactics, but I saw them and I found them to be shocking for two reasons. One of them is the fact they were being even used in the first place. So for instance, they regularly repeated a demonstrable lie that ranked choice voting actually discriminates against minority communities. There not only is no evidence of that, but the extent to which people have made that argument, it's been decisively refuted. It's a little bit like saying that global warming is fake because you don't believe in it. That doesn't make it so. It's not true. But they would make that argument repeatedly in various different forums, debates, with me. And it puts you in a tough position as someone who's debating in good faith, because you can say, as I did, that's not true. But then the other side says, yes, it is true. And now you're stuck in this pointless charade where the audience doesn't know who to believe necessarily. The second part of it that was disturbing is that there were members of the press who were moderating these debates who, hearing the other side use that trope about how ranked choice voting discriminates against minority communities, and didn't say, wait a minute, that's not true. They didn't know enough to say that's not true. And in fact, in one case on a Boston public radio station, the moderator, in the course of that exact back and forth, said, okay, well, I guess you guys just have a disagreement on this issue. And that's a terrible disservice to the public. And that's a disservice to the public caused in part by the person who decides to lie in order to make an argument, which that's a choice. but in part by the lack of preparation on the part of the person in the press to deal with that. And so we've seen this over the last number of years in our politics. You know, you can use those lies, and because of the fact that press is flat-footed in the face of that, they work. And I think that's a very corrosive reality that we're in. And I think my view is that people in the press and who are exposed to folks who use lying as a tool of public policy ought to call the person out for lying on the spot and say that's not okay. If they don't know that the person's lying, but they discover it later, that person should no longer be invited to be a participant or a source. You know, don't talk to them. These are people that have demonstrated themselves not to be reliable, contributors. But we don't see enough of that level of accountability, and I hope that that's something that people in the press can come to grips with, so that we can, really shun and shame people that act in that way.
So how do you believe the idea or concept of fake news has been altering the way news is delivered today?
It's a real problem. I mean, the notion of fake news, of course, is being perpetrated by people like Trump and others who are using it to make you question whether you can believe anything that you read. So what they're really doing is attacking the notion that there is such a thing as truth. Reporters, journalists, I think it's really important for them to just present the facts to people and to be seen as reliable disseminators of reality, of what the facts are of a situation. And when someone is able to use the platform of a news organization to spread things that are not true, then the news organization becomes complicit in that. And it's a shift, because what's happened is that we did live in a world up until the last number of years, and I think social media has been a contributor to this, in which there was a degree of shared agreement and understanding that no matter what it was that was going on, I can't straight up lie to you. I've got to at least, we have to be able to tell the truth, or else we can't all participate with each other. And for whatever reason, and by whoever's doing, at some point over the last number of years, it became okay to just straight up not tell the truth. And the trouble that the news media has had with this is that they still haven't quite figured it out. So you see it happening, for example, on these Sunday news programs where they've had numerous senators and other people saying, yeah, the election was stolen. And the press allows them to say these things and may push back on it, but they allow them to come on there and say things that those folks know isn't true. Well, that needs to stop. So again, when I wrote that piece after the election in Commonwealth talking about fake news and the use of lying as a tool of public policy, part of it was a call to action to those who act as the gatekeepers, which is to say the folks who are journalists, to say you have to stand for truth, you have to stand for democracy. And what that means is if people are going to use your platform to spread lies, they should no longer be welcome on your platform. And I hope that continues to happen, and that people stand up for what's right.
That's great. Was there anything else that you wanted to add that we haven't yet covered today?
Well, I will say it's a real honor to work with the Binienda Center, with Mark, with Barry, with the students. It's been going back now 6 or 7 years for me that I've had the opportunity, both when I was a candidate, when I was working on independent organizing with ranked choice voting, and in many other areas, to work on civic engagement. And I congratulate everybody, the students, the faculty, the leadership, the administration at Worcester State for their commitment to civic engagement, to civic education, and to community organizing and engagement in a way that makes our country better. So I'm tremendously grateful and truly honored.
Thank you for watching this segment of The Beat. Please remember to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter and Instagram. We will see you next time.